This presentation is intended to serve as an historical overview of how people have reacted to controversial books and their authors. While the topic of challenging and banning books still elicits strong feelings in modern society, we can at least be glad of a few things. First, authors no longer need to fear being flogged or burned at the stake for writing a controversial book. Second, and in the same vein, freedom of religion and freedom of the press have allowed for an explosion of literature. And while we may not agree with everything that gets published, at least literature is affordable to us all, and no longer the luxury item that it once was. Still, we'll see that these freedoms have caused a dramatic shift in regard to the sorts of materials that are challenged today. To start with, I'm going to suggest that the act of challenging, banning, or destroying a book is a result of a power struggle between two or more cultures. Now, a culture is really any group of people whose shared beliefs enable them to view themselves as a community. This could be based on religious, political, ethical, or a variety of other shared beliefs. When you look at the instances over time of when books have been challenged or destroyed, they usually fit into three categories. First, heresy. Second, political conflict, the wars that often went with political conflict, and the destruction of national memory or national culture that often accompanied those wars. Third, materials considered obscene, inappropriate, or that were threatening to values or tradition. As you look at these categories, you may be thinking, wait, can't one apply to the other? And you'd be right, there's definitely overlap between these groups. The truth is, it's difficult to come up with totally isolated categories, mainly because the reasons books are challenged and destroyed so often overlap. So let's dive into the category of heresy. When we usually think of heretics, we think of things like witch burnings. The truth is, anyone who doesn't believe the official stance of a religion could be classified as a heretic. We don't see that much anymore, but keep in mind that abiding by religious dogma was a much bigger deal the farther back in history you look. Christianity was officially sanctioned across much of Europe when the Emperor Constantine had a vision of the cross on a battlefield, had his soldiers paint that symbol on their shields, and then proceeded to win his battle. In 303 AD, just 10 years before Christianity got the nod from Constantine, over 20,000 Christians were executed by the Emperor Diocletian, who also ordered that all Christian books be burned. Now, you would think that a history of persecution like that would have sort of a mollifying effect on the way Christians viewed other religions, but it didn't. Once Christianity was established as the dominant religion in Europe, those Christians abandoned their memories of persecution and actually began to assert power and control even within their own circles. For example, religious councils deleted and kept books out of the document that eventually became the Bible. You move forward a few hundred years, and in 371 AD, the Roman Emperor ordered all pagan books to be removed from private libraries. Later, the Roman Emperor closed the Academy in Athens and ordered all non-Christian books, statues, and images to be removed and burned. Skip forward again, and around 640 AD, Pope John IV instructed the Holy Roman Emperor that the writings against the Council of Chalcedon be destroyed. And the destruction of non-Christian materials extended into other religions as well. In the 1200s, for example, Pope Gregory IX ordered the kings of Europe to confiscate and burn the Talmud, basically a Jewish holy book that discusses traditions as they apply to Jewish laws, and other Jewish books as well. What transpired was that 23 cartloads of Jewish books were confiscated and burned in the streets of Paris. Justification for decisions like this often came from the verses in Acts, which you can see on the screen there. And coincidentally, many people still use these verses from Acts 19 as justification for burning and destroying books today. Now, in the 13 and 1400s, books were painstakingly produced by hand, meaning that it could take months or even years to produce a single book. Then, in 1450, the printing press was introduced to Europe, and this resulted in a dramatic increase in the number of books published each year. You can see that in the 1300s, around 2,750,000 books were published. In the 1400s, that quadrupled to 11 million. In the 1500s, that number novemdecupled, or multiplied by 19 times. In the subsequent centuries, that number doubled and doubled again. Now, even with the invention of the printing press, most books that were published were fairly innocent. They were fiction, stories written to instill moral lessons, or some other benign work. But books had been owned by the very wealthy and very educated. Generally, it was only priests who owned a Bible, which was generally written in Latin. Suddenly, books became not necessarily cheap, but affordable to larger segments of the population. To top it off, books were published in people's own languages, meaning that ideas could be spread far and wide, or at least farther and wider than they had been in the past. Now, the mere fact that the masses had access to so much more material alarmed secular and religious leaders. And in 1487, Pope Innocent VIII ordered the burning of all books that were scandalous, against Orthodox belief, or lacking in piety. 12 years later, in 1499, Cardinal Cisneros in Spain ordered the burning of books suspected of expressing Jewish and Muslim notions. You can really look at this as an assault on anything that could possibly be considered unchristian. Not anti-Christian, mind you, just not Christian. In 1515, the Fifth Lateran Council concluded that printing could also lead to erroneous and dangerous publications. Which is a fair point. People could print information that was incorrect or dangerous. We deal with that concern today. But the council then called for the introduction of ecclesiastical censorship, and Pope Leo X ordered the burning of all books published without church approval. Church censorship and control of the press had officially begun. Now, despite these efforts, dissent found its way to the people. A prime example is Martin Luther's 95 Theses. Now, first off, posting topics for debate on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg was a common practice. That was how scholars and theologians got their argument out to the populace and just sparked debate amongst each other. So the fact that Martin Luther nailed his theses to the door, or probably tacked it to the door, in itself not that big of a deal. What caused a stir was his argument. Luther was against the sale of indulgences, which was basically, if you committed a sin or were planning to commit a sin, you could basically pay a fine, or in other words, donate money to the church, and a priest would absolve you of that sin, and basically you could buy time out of purgatory. Luther took issue with this and a few other practices that the church was condoning, and when word circulated about his theses, Pope Leo X issued an official statement, or a papal bull, that Luther's work should be burned and that he would be excommunicated if he didn't recant his statements. Well, Luther responded by burning the papal bull that threatened his excommunication. And this really goes to show how the burning of books or letters can be used to send a message. You anger me, so I burn what you write. I disagree with you so strongly that I'll burn your threat to excommunicate me. Now, this whole event had two main results. First, it helped spark the Protestant Reformation, which is why we today have Lutherans, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, etc. It also made sales of Luther's books skyrocket. Now, with the Reformation in full swing and with more and more works being published, the Church basically decided that it needed to crack down on publishing more, and in 1559 launched the first of many copies of the Index of Prohibited Works. This was basically a guide to Catholic reading that existed until the 1960s. And initially, just being a Protestant author got you put on this list of banned books. For example, if you were a Lutheran who published a zoological encyclopedia that simply provided a picture of an animal and a description of that animal, your book was still banned for all Catholics to read. And by the time the book was finally disbanded in the 1960s, there were more than 5,000 books that Catholics were prohibited from reading. And these books included works by many famous Enlightenment and Reformation thinkers, including Martin Luther, John Calvin, René Descartes, John Locke, and Voltaire. Now take a minute and think about the implications here. If you were a Catholic college student and were required to read something by John Locke or Voltaire, that would have put you in a rather uncomfortable position. So far, we know that most folks had no problem burning or destroying books that were considered unchristian. But what about the authors of those controversial books? In many cases, they suffered a fate similar to the materials they wrote. Back in the Middle Ages, heretics, just like witches, were frequently burned at the stake, or were beaten, whipped, or pilloried, which is that picture on the far left. So here are a few examples. A theologian named Michael Servetus actually managed to turn both the Catholics and Protestants against him when he published a book arguing that the traditional view of the Trinity was incorrect. He was arrested in France and escaped, so they ended up burning him in effigy there. He was captured again in Switzerland and was then poorly strangled, and then while half-conscious, was burned at the stake with his books tied to him. You may have also heard of the New International Version or New Revised Standard Edition of the Bible, basically just Bibles written in plain English. Well, in the 1530s, a man named William Tyndale was burned at the stake for writing a version of the Bible in English. Until then, the Bible was written only in Latin. So once everyone could read it, they could study it at home, they could begin interpreting it for themselves, and they no longer had to rely on the clergy to read and interpret it for them. Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, published a plea for religious tolerance, which was burned by the Order of Parliament in 1644. Williams was later banished from Massachusetts. So really, his banishment from Massachusetts and the burning of his plea for religious tolerance is really the reason why Rhode Island was founded. Now, by the 1700s, the Pope had ordered that all of the Enlightenment writers' works be burned. So, works addressing dangerous ideas about civil rights, the rights of man, and books questioning the supreme power of the Church basically had to go. Now, today, largely because of things like the French Revolution, the 30 Years' War, and the Declaration of Independence, we don't hear much these days about heretical books or, indeed, their authors being burned or killed. But there are some instances that do pop up. The Amazing Grace Church in North Carolina, for example, believed that the King James Version of the Bible was the only official, acceptable version of the Bible, and on October 31st, 2009, gathered up all other versions of the Bible and had a Bible-burning party, for lack of a better term, at their church. Terry Jones, the now kind of infamous leader of the Dove World Outreach Center, in 2010 reportedly burned a Quran in the sanctuary of that church. In 2013, he was arrested with 2,998 Qurans soaked in kerosene in the bed of his truck. So instances of destroying or trying to destroy material that is still considered heretical does still happen today. So let's move on now to national memory, war, and politics. When I say national memory, it could just as easily be a nation's cultural memory. I mean the shared attributes of a people that allow them to identify as a group. America, for example, has no official national language, no official religion, but it does have a political border, and it is a democracy. Mexico, on the other hand, is 87% Catholic, and nearly everyone there speaks a Spanish language derivation. So, in terms of national memory, war, politics, destruction of books as it pertains to that topic, just like the Jewish Talmud has been destroyed throughout history, there have been many other instances where one culture has tried to damage another by destroying its printed works. In 1258, the descendant of Genghis Khan, Hulagu Khan, decided to place a large portion of the Middle East under direct control of the Mongol Empire. Now, the Mongols basically wanted Caliph al-Mustasim, the religious leader of Baghdad, to personally visit the Mongol Empire and submit to the leader of that empire. And here's how the Mongols usually worked. You give in to what they want, and they would largely let you be. You just had to get used to the fact that they were in charge and would periodically have to pay them tribute. If you resisted, they would fight you, they would win, and they would typically flatten your town or city. Well, the Caliph refused to submit to the Mongols, and after a very short battle, the Mongols sacked Baghdad. At least 90,000 residents were killed. But the reason the siege of Baghdad still stands out today is that at the time, Baghdad was the intellectual hub of the Middle East. It housed the House of Wisdom, which was one of the largest libraries in the world. It had observatories and was second to none when it came to the study of humanities, science, math, astronomy, medicine, even geography and map-making. It was also a translation center and had converted nearly all of the important remaining ancient Greek works to Arabic, thereby preserving them for future generations. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad, the survivors said that the rivers ran black for months due to the number of books that had been thrown into those rivers. The Mongols hadn't just conquered Baghdad, they'd basically eradicated Islam from the map. And it took centuries for that kind of culture to build up again. Now, something happened similar in 1562 when Spain took control of Central America. The Franciscan friar Diego de Landa landed on the Yucatan Peninsula in 1549 at the age of 25, and his mission was to convert the Maya to Christianity, which he and other friars tried to do for nearly a decade. Now, unfortunately, his tactics included holding masses where Maya nobles were basically ordered to give up their beliefs and embrace Christianity. And eventually, he decided that these conversions weren't happening quickly enough, and he essentially started holding Inquisition trials similar to the Spanish Inquisition. So in these trials, he ordered Maya to renounce their faith. He eventually started torturing and killing them in an effort to get them to confess to human sacrifice and other sins, and convinced that the Maya were basically involved in religious traditions that were the work of the devil. In 1562, De Landa burned around 5,000 religious images and at least 27 Mayan codices, which contained their official written history, beliefs, and religious practices. In an attempt to civilize the Maya, De Landa basically wiped out a considerable portion of their written history and language. A little closer to home, during the War of 1812, the British burned the nation's capital, which at that point contained the Library of Congress. Now, Thomas Jefferson offered to sell his library to Congress as a replacement, and unfortunately, in 1851 on Christmas Eve, a accidental fire destroyed around 2/3 of what Congress had purchased from Jefferson in the first place. A bit sad, but the original instance there in 1812 shows that sometimes books can just be a example of collateral damage in a war between one nation and another. But sometimes the destruction of books can be almost entirely political. Normally, we think of anti-Semitism as being a distinctly Nazi problem. But in reality, Russia had been persecuting and hunting Jews for centuries. Between around 1800 and 1900, Russia had herded most of its Jews into a region known as the Pale of Settlement. Now, in many cases, Jews were prohibited from living outside of this area and almost always from living in large cities outside of the Pale of Settlement. In addition to being restricted in their choice of where to live, Jews were legally second-class citizens in most of Russia. There were restrictions on what they could wear, what jobs they could have, and in some cases they were taxed for being Jews. Now, Ivan Blok was a Jew by blood, but a Christian by faith, and was also a member of the Russian Finance Ministry's scientific community. Now, Blok spent nearly 10 years compiling statistical data that proved that Jews were actually beneficial to the Russian economy, and used that to argue for allowing them better treatment and more freedom, and he did this in a 5-volume book. But because his findings directly contradicted the traditional belief that Jews were a threat to Russia, the Russian Council of Ministers actually banned this book and burned almost every copy, which is just a sad reminder of what sometimes public opinion can cause. And that leads us to what's probably the most famous or most well-known example of book burning, which is the Nazi era of Germany. Now, it may surprise you to know that the majority of book burnings that were carried out in this time were actually done by the German Student Association, German college students, rather than the Nazi military itself. And these students would raid their personal collections, their families' books, books from public libraries and university libraries, and they basically destroyed over 20,000 copies of anything that was considered anti-German, democratic, communist or written by a communist, anything pacifist in nature, or anything written by liberals, gays, or Jews. But then after World War II, during the period of denazification, the Allies ended up burning over 30,000 titles that they believed had the potential to rekindle Nazism in Germans. It's a little ironic that the way that the Allies decided to deal with a culture made famous for book burning was by burning its books. And then after the denazification of German literature, there was actually a push within the US, in the public sphere and within the government, to root out communists or communist sympathizers in an era known as the Red Scare. Now, police officers and sometimes citizen vigilante groups would raid bookstores or sometimes communist bookstores and arrest their employees, and private citizens demanded that libraries remove books that were too leftist, and sometimes any book dealing with Russia at any depth. So sometimes fear can just make us do some weird stuff even on the home front. And this takes us into our last category, books that are considered obscene, inappropriate, or threatening to tradition or values. Now, I want to start off by sharing 3 quotes here. The first is, "The free communication of ideas and opinions is one of the most precious of the rights of man." That came out of the French National Assembly in 1789. Following that, we have a quote from the United States Congress in 1791. "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." This is basically a declaration that free speech and free communication is vital to a healthy citizenry. Now, this last section that I want to share with you is paraphrased, but the argument is basically that to have a good society, we must have good citizens. To have good citizens, society's children must be well educated. To be well educated, children must be exposed to good material and shielded from bad material. It is the obligation of the state to educate its citizens, so the state should allow only good material and suppress bad material. Now, this is sort of contradictory to the first 2 statements up there. And believe it or not, that's actually a statement made by Plato in 380 BC. And this is largely where we are today, in the crosshairs of protecting free speech on one hand and protecting society from people being able to speak and publish freely. In today's society, we can also frequently replace state with parents or schools or libraries, right? And there are people who believe that it is in the best interest of society to suppress those materials they consider harmful, either to children or to society as a whole. Now, in reality, there are very few publicized book burnings today. They've kind of lost popularity over the last 100 years, and I'm sure being linked to the Nazis probably didn't help. But if we backtrack about 150 years, there are some pretty stirring examples. The Anti-Slavery Society's Great Postal Campaign of 1835 flooded the South with abolitionist literature, and it triggered a wave of anger and repression in the South. In Charleston, South Carolina, around 3,000 people gathered to destroy this seized anti-slavery literature and burned basically a scarecrow of William Lloyd Garrison in effigy. In 1854, Garrison burned a copy of the Fugitive Slave Law in public, basically as a critique and protest against the way African Americans were treated and perceived in the United States. And in 1857, a man named Hinton Helper published a book called The Impending Crisis of the South, which used census statistics to argue that slavery was holding back the South's economic growth, prosperity, and cultural development. Now, Helper was actually a racist. He did not care for black people at all. But regardless of his own personal beliefs and the reality that he was using this data only to make a economic argument against slavery, there were actually people who were jailed and hanged for owning his book, simply because it was a critique of the Southern way of life. Helper actually had to flee for his life to the North, despite the fact that his book became a bestseller. And in the 1870s, the United States passed the Comstock Act. Now, it actually made it illegal to sell or distribute anything that was deemed obscene. The Confessions by Rousseau, which was his autobiography, was actually on this list of disallowed material. In his autobiography, he admitted to blaming a girl for a theft he committed, urinating in a cooking pot someone was using, sending his own kids to an orphanage, and it was basically banned because the government believed that it would be injurious to public morality. The book Ulysses by James Joyce was banned because it might cause impure and lustful thoughts. And actually, a book containing a single image of the Sistine Chapel that included nudity was claimed by the U.S. Customs Office before someone made the argument, do you realize how ridiculous you're being by blocking the shipment of a book that has a picture of the Sistine Chapel? Now today, the government applies the Miller test, which applies contemporary community standards to works, which basically allows for the evolution of what's considered lewd or offensive. So a lot of what was written in the Comstock Act has since been disbanded and replaced. And today, we have largely replaced the church and state as the primary challengers of books. We've really undergone a shift in society. So everyday people are now doing what the church and government used to do when it comes to banning and challenging materials. Harry Potter, for example, was challenged 448 times in 2001, largely by everyday people like parents. Pastor Jack Brock in New Mexico called the Harry Potter series a masterpiece of satanic deception and claimed that the books taught children how to get into witchcraft and become witch wizards or warlocks. Having read the Harry Potter series, my understanding is that to become a witch, wizard, or warlock, you need to wait for your letter from Hogwarts and get on the Hogwarts Express, but apparently he believed otherwise. Huck Finn was also challenged repeatedly and sometimes banned for its racist language. Now, the controversy around this is that many people argue that while Huck Finn does have racist language, the overall message of the book is a critique against racism and slavery. And finally, the autobiography of Malcolm X has been restricted in some libraries after being referred to as a how-to manual for crime. Now, this can be seen very clearly when looking at book challenges over the past 20 years or so. Rather than being based on heresy or politics, book challenges are now largely focused on explicit situations and foul language. And we can also see a change in venue. These challenges arise not in churches, castles, or public squares, but in schools, in classrooms, and school libraries. So we've really shifted, in other words, from fighting the church and state for the right to publish to mostly fighting books for children and even young adults. So thank you for watching this presentation on the history of reactions to banned and challenged books. Hopefully you found it enlightening.